Hello and welcome, friends, to another episode of the Chris Andrew podcast. We're back at our weekly schedule now. I took a couple of weeks to get the last episode out. Apologies for that. It was quite a dense one, and I wanted to make sure that I said everything in it correctly. If you didn't have a chance to listen to that, might be worth going back to. Everything I said in it is still current. It's about the Ukraine war and how there was an opportunity for peace a few years ago that was sunk not by Putin, not by Zelensky, but by, of all people, Boris Johnson on behalf of President Biden, presumably. But on to happier topics today. I realize that something I talk a lot about in the show is how the pace of change has increased over time. In that, the difference between life in 100 AD and 200 AD was pretty small, whereas by the time you get to 1900 or 1800, it's larger. But now, the difference between a life in 2010 and 2020 is already huge. So who knows what that will be like in the coming years. All of which is to say, our human brains and our cultures adapt to this pace of change in different ways. And some of it we can't really adapt to at the rate that's required. And you see that in some of the big problems that we're not really able to collectively deal with, like leaving plastic everywhere, or climate change, or all the social collapses that have accompanied social media, phone use, et cetera, et cetera. But I wanted to talk about today. But I was thinking about what all these changes and the pace means. And I realized that there's sort of cultural lag and individual behavior lag in how we plan our lives, because it's hard to account for that rate of change. We don't know how quick it will be. We don't know how dramatic it will be. And many of us, I realize, are planning for things that there's every chance will be unlikely to happen. Now, that's always true. I'm sure that the people who woke up and baked the bread in Pompeii before Vesuvius erupted didn't anticipate how their day was going to end. But there are some moving pieces here where the rate of change has already occurred, but the cultural lag still exists in how we do our planning and how we conceive of our own lives and the world. And I thought it would be fun to do an around the grounds of those, because where there's problems, where there's people making mistakes or whatever, there's also an arbitrage opportunity for me and you in how we make decisions to be a bit more considered and to hopefully get the jump on some of these changes as they're occurring. Basically, to pick a simple metaphor, and it's a common one that you hear, growing up every night on TV, I watched, and everybody who's my age watched, The Simpsons. And that was a story, a sitcom world where it's the same every week. And it's around a guy who's younger than me. I guess he's 37 or something like that. He's providing for his whole family off a sort of bum job. And they live in a big house, and his partner doesn't work, and they have 3 kids by that age. And just all these things that just are kind of surreal to think about now, but they were unquestioned norms one generation ago. So if you're living in the cultural conditioning where you think that that's going to be a reasonable future for you to pursue, well, the ingredients are going to look a little bit different, and you're going to need to adapt. That type of phenomenon, that sort of cultural lag across a whole suite of things, is what we're going to look at today. And I think it could be really fun. Thanks so much for listening. And as always, a special extra thanks to my Patreons and to new patron, Maisie Lyon. Thank you for joining. Very, very appreciative of all of you, as always. I couldn't do this show without you. And my enthusiasm to grow it comes from the energy that you bring commenting on my Patreon things. But you don't need to give money to be a part of it. There's a free tier. Also, you can follow me on Instagram at Chris Andrew Podcast. Anyway, let's get into it. You'll love it. So better planning and overcoming the cultural lag. I think I'm going to have to explain it again because it's an abstract concept and maybe a new one to you. I think it's new because I invented it and I'm the greatest public intellect of our time. Massively underrated, but I'm sure somebody else has talked about it in more eloquent terms. In either case, what I'm talking about is this phenomenon where people are planning for the known world as it is, but given the trajectories that we can see and the rate of changes that we can't see, it's very likely that that planning will be completely moot. And as such, we need to do better consideration of how we conceive of the present and future. And also, there's an opportunity there where the herd is moving one way, we can move the other if we think we have an idea of where things will actually be and end up living a better life or making some money or any number of other things, avoiding traps. And actually, I've got a great example of this. I remember during the coronavirus lockdowns, I was a performer at the time full time, and I saw what was coming as it happened. And I immediately canceled all of my shows and basically just sat around staring at my hands in despair, figuring out what to do. Whereas the other performers that didn't, they saw initially there was a lockdown for 4 weeks and then another 6 weeks and whatever. They continued to book shows and continued to schedule things. And those things inevitably got cancelled. I was in Melbourne, so everything got cancelled for a long, long time. But those people who booked things were eligible to get compensation from the government because they'd lost something, which was so annoying to me because I felt it was obvious that, that a disease was only going to grow exponentially in its threat, not arithmetically. And as such, the consequences would be stronger over time, not weaker. And it was frustrating for me to see all these people who hadn't done the planning get all these rewards. Anyway, that's more about bad government policy than what we're talking about today. Instead, I'd still rather be me and have the psychological piece of having made those choices and being able to pivot to doing something else rather than being fixated on still doing the shows that were just not going to exist in that world at that time. And in exactly the same way, I remember going to preseason football training just before the season started, and the coach was saying that, look, there's a bit of a lockdown. We're going to be closed for next month, but we're going to be starting again the season in 6 weeks. And again, I remember thinking, there's no way that's going to happen. So when the herd's going one way, if you can see the trend and move another way, there's a huge advantage to be gained. And here those gains are largely because with the huge changes that we're facing at the moment, and I've talked about them a bit in the show already in interviews and just on my own regarding artificial intelligence, the future of work, the coming concentration of wealth that's going to occur, et cetera, and the social changes that will have to accompany that. Society's going to look even more different today than today does to the year 2000. In probably in just 10 years, which is scary and exciting, but it means that you can't do the type of planning that we are culturally habituated into doing and also encouraged to do by our parents, our peers, just the general incentive structures of our societies. They're kind of not going to apply in a lot of realms. The tricky thing is the rate of change is not even. So where something like the viability of owning a DVD rental vending machine is diminishing rapidly, the viability of owning a Coke vending machine is probably pretty stable, certainly by comparison. So it's hard to know exactly what those areas are. So that's what we're going to look at today. But suffice to say that value is not an evenly applied concept, and it's in many areas a socially constructed concept. Maybe in all areas, actually. Certainly, we see people thinking that things are good that are not good, and thinking that things are bad that are actually good. We see that everywhere. And just to give a headline example before I dive into the specifics of how value can change over time. In At Home by Bill Bryson, he discusses how the British Isles used to be so heavily surrounded by lobster that it was virtually a worthless food. And servants in houses would even put into their annual contract that they were not to be fed lobster more than once a week because it was so cheap and nasty. Whereas now we've fished them into oblivion and lobster is worth a lot of money because it's a rarer commodity. The taste of lobster is still broadly exactly the same, but the cost is different. So if it wasn't obvious to you already, the cost that we put on things and the value that we apportion to things is very socially motivated and market driven. I always think that a really good apple or something can often be the best fruit, but it's rarely conceived of as the tastiest fruit because there are so many, forgive me for saying bad apples, but also because they're abundant, they're not compelling. But we don't live life through the price of the things that we purchase. We live life through our experience and senses. So that's going to be a central component to how I navigate some of today's topics. Thank you for hearing me out, and I hope that this preamble was worth it. Perhaps the most obvious one to talk about is our careers, because career formation culture has been pretty established, I guess, for the last century, but it's very obvious that the way in which we've gone about our careers is radically different now to what it was even just a couple of generations ago. Even for me at my age, I'm 40, it's never really been the case that people graduate from their schooling or apprenticeship or whatever, go into a field in a firm, work in that firm, work their way up, and then are on a track to then retire from that at age 60. That's certainly an exception already for my generation, but whatever it is that is the opposite of that is becoming much more common, with people jumping from jobs and having, I think the average is 4 or 5 careers they anticipate that you'll have now. But for many people in many societies, young people are not having a career at all. I kind of feel a little bit like that myself. I mean, I've got a performance career, but it's kind of pivoted into this now because I've got kids and can't be out all the time, and who even knows what that will be like for the next generation. Whereas for the past generation, for my generation included, it was a very rational thing to pick a vocation, say journalism, go study it, try and get a cadetship or internship or whatever, and start working at a newspaper or a media outlet. And then that would carry you through. You'd have deviations within that, but you'd have your skill set and could keep growing within that. But now that kind of seems like a madness thing because, when I was going into the workforce, that every town had a newspaper and every town had a TV station with dozens of people that worked for it reporting on local news. And now it's kind of laughable, the idea that you would go into that thinking that you're going to get a secure career. I think they used to track this stuff by the price you got paid per word. And I think, the union rate would be like $1 or something. And then the average ended up being 10 cents. But how much would you get per word in an era where there's large language models and macro systems just automating entire news services rather than just assisting? It's not a dead industry, but the value proposition is different and there's room for fewer players. So it's something that you wouldn't go into with the same confidence. I picked journalism just randomly then, but you could pick anything. Another career that's adjacent to mine is sync music, to have a music studio, to write and produce original music for TV shows. Everything you see, ads, whatever, they've all got original music that was historically paid for. Now we're at the cusp and I think tipping point over with AI where that could just be generated in seconds. And okay, in some ways it's an inferior quality because it can't be as targeted or have the same fidelity. But in some ways it's actually superior quality because not everyone's the best songwriter or producer, and you can get exactly what the genre pocket is that you want just with a couple of prompts rather than having to engage a sound engineer professional, musicians that have spent years learning their craft, etc., etc., etc. So if you had set out planning and intending to have a career in that realm, it doesn't exist for you anymore. So you need to do something else. And these are a couple of early pillars to fall, but it's very close to becoming for everything. I would be wary of learning to code even at this point because the investment is one of diminutive returns, where previously everything that we see online had to be coded. That's no longer going to be the case as there's more and more automation of that and fewer power players that, okay, they know how to code, but there's fewer spaces for people that need to do that, and only the true winners win, which goes to that sort of trillionaires concept that I looked at in that earlier episode. I have a friend who is at the very front of AI. Unfortunately, they want to remain anonymous in this and won't come onto the podcast and talk to me. They almost couldn't be more at the very front and at the top of the advancements that are occurring. And their life plan, they said to me that in 18 months, everything that they do will be completely replaceable. And their life plan is to hang out with their kids and surf and then figure something out along the way. They said that to me 6 months ago. I don't want to get too into it because maybe it gets a bit tedious how much we hear about it, but it's so easy to imagine how whole medical systems could be replaced with just prompts and what have you. And of course, that's not fair to the people that work in that now, but it's plausible that could even end up being superior in a lot of ways. So I don't think anyone would, for any generation in quite a while, say that it's not worth going into medicine because that's not going to be a real job, or there aren't going to be lots of jobs. But that could be a conceivable reality to us within 1 or 2 Olympics, within 1 or 2 Olympiads. Conversely, in this realm, the arbitrage benefit that you can get for that is at least being open to the fact that dynamism is going to be likely, and whatever sphere it is that you're working in, imagine how it's going to be disrupted and sort of get the jump on what that might be. It's disruption is not always something that you can easily take advantage of, and some painful things that occur will just inevitably suck. But I think at least by being open to that dynamism and understanding that wherever you are today, if you're in a big organization or something like that, it's perfectly plausible that 80% of those people will be gone within 2 years and that you might be one of them. I think the earlier you can understand, if that is the case for the type of place that you work and you think that, the earlier you can make peace with that, the better position you'll be to navigate whatever it is that you hope to be doing next. And who knows, maybe you, one of my listeners, will hear this and be like, that's true. Goodness, I could leverage that exactly where I am. Oh, I could leverage that across every organization. And then you end up becoming one of those trillionaires that I was talking about, in which case you had better be in the top tier of my Patreon, patreon.com/Andrew. Thank you. Another big realm of planning that dominates many, many people's lives, most people's lives, I would say, obviously not everybody, is family. Like, are you going to have a family? Even if the choice not to do it is a consideration that most people have at least some reckoning with, and it's of consequence to how the rest of your life pans out. It's been normal in my lifetime that my peers and people below me and above me would consider it to be necessary to have stable employment, stable housing, and just a bit of a buffer of security in life, of stability, before making the decision to have children. And I've seen many people sequence the step in exactly that way, sequence those steps. And I'd say that's broadly still the norm. But in a situation where those conditions are increasingly unattainable for people, it's kind of a madness to think that you would need to sequence those things where you don't materially have to. It's just a cultural preference. And I think getting caught in the assumption that those things need to exist for you before having a family can become a real point of pain if you don't see examples of people in your life who rent and then have children, or people who have insecure work and still have children. You may keep pushing it down the line and pushing it down the line until you just inevitably don't do it, or you not consciously make the decision to not do it because these baseline conditions that aren't actually prerequisite requirements are never met. So I would suggest that if that's a resonant thinking for you, you just feel like you've not interrogated that assumption, that you do interrogate it, because it may not be the case at all. And also, it's just not unlikely that most of us will not have secure work or secure housing. Of course, many of us still do, and they're not the people I'm speaking to here. But it's worth paying consideration for your friends and family that find themselves in this situation, because it's just not going to be an attainable thing for everybody. It's not that sort of news.com.au meme where it's like, I bought my house at 21 and I had 7 kids by 25. Why haven't other, people my age? Because Gen Z is lazy because they look at the phone or whatever. Yeah, okay. Almost nobody is going to be able to do that stuff. And all the data is pretty clear. I think I'll share some graphs on my Instagram this week for how there's been a huge decline in people being insecure housing and work and married and all the other things that people normally line up as ducks before choosing to grow a family, and how that's sort of radically collapsed in the last generation or two and is still declining. And this is something I can relate to personally for various reasons, some in my control, some absolutely not in my control. Between the ages of maybe 18 and 40, I lived in easily 20 plus places, and I didn't like that. And if I'd known setting out into adulthood that would have been the case in advance, I think I would have been a bit more zen about the things that you can do while not having a permanent house. And I think I would have made different choices in my life accordingly. It's hard to think that I wouldn't. And I'm not saying those would have been better or worse, but yes, it's quite predictable for many of us that will be the norm into the future. I think, unfortunately, on balance, but the arbitrage opportunity is to, as always, engage with reality, just like with the career stuff, and make your own decisions against that, rather than just sort of assume, where's my Homer Simpson life? When's the Homer Simpson life coming for me? That guy was so dumb and had a house and whatever. It's surely coming for me. Well, the conditions are different, and it's potentially not. Another huge thing that I think's changed, at least in my lifetime alone, is travel and tourism. This is for a few reasons. Firstly, there's a lot more people with a lot more money, and we can travel around a lot more cheaply. So it's really just ballooned. Whereas, a few generations ago, it might be a once in a lifetime thing to go to Paris or whatever. Now you can go there yearly without it really scratching the sides. Not everybody, but many of us can do it. And that has a huge consequence on the amount of people that are doing it, which has a huge consequence on the quality of the experience itself. And in my assessment, it's become, in many instances, the type of thing that people plan around and conceive of in the way that people would have in the 70s, 80s, 90s, etc. But the experience is vastly different, and in many instances, vastly inferior and a poor value proposition. This doesn't apply to everywhere and all people in all situations. Obviously, it's different. But I think that there are a lot of cultural touch points and icons that we all think of as things that are important for us to engage with, or nice opportunities for us to enjoy. And because so many of us have that in our consciousness, we're all attracted to it. And these icons in particular reach a tipping point where they're actually no longer good to be at, because it's no longer the case of having an organic experience with whatever it might be. But instead, you're engaging with a sort of veiled simulacrum where the tourism experience itself is the dominant one, rather than what if the original core kernel may have been compelling about whatever it is that you're visiting. I'll give some examples, because that's a bit abstract maybe. But I think iconic artworks are a good example. I mean, the experience of visiting an iconic artwork, if you've done it, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's almost a joke. It's almost surreal when you're doing it. Say if you go to see the Mona Lisa at the Louvre, close enough, you're not really seeing it. You're not getting time to look at the painting and have it open to you. Firstly, you can just look at anything online, and we don't. I mean, I don't see people scrolling paintings. I mean, there'll be 0.25% that do it, but most of us aren't like, oh, I'd love to see this painting. Oh, I can just look at them all the time or get a print or whatever. No, we go to them because there's a social experience attached to it, and the value of, oh, this is one of the most valuable paintings in the world. It's priceless, really, and it's an experience I want. and it's an infectious experience because everybody wants it, and so there's a social hype around it. And you go, and firstly, like, you're 15 meters away from it because of the other 200 people that are in the room. Secondly, everybody's got their phone up taking a picture of the thing. Like, the experience is actually the tourist experience of seeing it rather than seeing the painting itself, which for mine is certainly interesting, but it's not something that I would choose over, say, having a really good sandwich around the corner from where I live. But one of them costs thousands of dollars to do, and one of them costs a few bucks. So I think that's a really good example of the type of tourism that is now trash, but people still pursue in their planning as though it is good. In so many instances, what you're actually getting with tourism is a sort of simulacrum phantom experience of something that's been replicated over time because people come and people like it. The market re-gears around the people that come and like it. You're getting the commodity rather than the organic original point of interest, because things are networked and complex, but it's easy to print sort of photocopies of them. But if you print the photocopies enough and they're removed enough from the source, they actually lose their value. Some things are robust enough to keep it. Say, for example, if you go to Paris and have a pain au chocolat or whatever, it's delicious. It's much better than the one that you're getting in Canberra or whatever. But to give another example, in Budapest, where I live, you can get chimney cakes everywhere, and I have many great experiences of getting chimney cakes at Kurtoshkolat. You go into the countryside at a festival, maybe there's cold weather, and they'll be making them over the coals of the fires, and they're just delicious, crispy and tasty. But in the city, they've realized that people like to come and eat this distinct Hungarian food. And so they're just making them in an electric oven and then storing them so they get a bit stale, so they're no good. And they're not a special thing. Plus they cost twice as much or whatever. And the experience is just such a shit thing compared to the context of what the original type of thing is. That exact type of experience, I think that you can get in most cultures of the world at their tourist hotspots. And what you're getting is not actually good, but those are the types of experience that people are spending a lot of money and time and energy to go and collect. And I think it's worth noting, because when I was young, certainly the idea of travel and seeing the world and getting these experiences was the one of the higher virtues of things that you could plan to do in life. But I think it's kind of no longer the case, or at least not in the way that people still conceive of it as. The arbitrage opportunity of that is that there's all these places to go that nobody goes, where you can still have those authentic experiences. I don't know. I don't have the time or resources to do that stuff so much at the moment, but I imagine it going through Central Asia would be awesome, and because you could encounter people that, sorry, I don't want to be a fuckhead and say that it's only virtuous to do things that nobody else is doing. You could still get a 10 out of 10 tourist experience in Paris. I just don't think that you're going to get it by going to the Mona Lisa, going to the Eiffel Tower, thinking that you're living in Amelie when that city is fundamentally different from that period. But I mean, you see automatic weapons and barricaded streets and whatever. It's like, it's not as whimsical as perhaps the films would lead you to believe. I shouldn't pick on Paris. You could pick anywhere for these things, but Paris is kind of an archetype in many ways. And it's still cool. I like it. Heaps of cool stuff. It suffers from... There are parts of it that suffer from their success. And the same is true for, pick another couple of places in Europe, Prague and Krakow. Those are beautiful castle-centered cities, gorgeous, immaculate, fairy tale places. But I would have loved to go to them 40 years ago when those fairy tale places were actually full of people that lived there doing stuff, rather than sort of a hard rock cafe and a place that sells trinkets and, whatever, where everything's just sort of geared to extract money from foreigners and people aren't living organic lives. I think I read of Krakow Castle, there's 200 people that live there or something like that. Whereas that is the center of the city. Like, that is a gorgeous spot and should be full of, not a dictator, but wouldn't it be cool if instead of having 200 people that live there and every shop being a market stall to suck money out of tourists, it was a castle that people happen to live in, and you could go there and see just whatever, people having their piano lessons or whatever else it is that they're up to. I think that's cooler. And so the opportunity there is to go to places that are off the beaten track a little bit, but also to realize that, for that money and time, I could have an incredible experience where I live. I don't need to fetishize taking a long flight to get value of going somewhere else and having a different mindset or experiencing things, particularly as, not to be too cynical, but as so many of the places in the world that we go to start to feel a bit the same in the stuff that we can consume and see. Another interesting one that is changing. Look, I'm not an expert to talk about, but I still think it's interesting to raise. Maybe you'll have your own ideas against my inexpertise, but money. I have not been a good person at finding money in this life. I hope to improve, but I still think it's worth talking about because I do know a bit about social phenomena, and I obviously like to spot connections between things that happen over time. And I think that one interesting thing I've observed is that we treat money as a fixed good when it just so obviously isn't. And not everybody, but it's very easy to think that your $20 now, $20 in 3 months, they're the same thing. They're not, especially now. You should not look at the money that you have and how you pursue it as a fixed or even secure resource. And I don't want to get too panicky because, again, I'm not an expert in this domain. But there's a brittleness that can come to putting financial considerations at the center of your life, particularly if they're asset-based or money-based. And I think that brittleness is worth avoiding. To give some specific examples, it's not impossible to see certain markets or economies not only taking a dip, but even almost collapsing in the coming years. And these are markets that we put a lot of resources into. Obvious ones are sort of housing bubbles, tech investment bubbles, cryptocurrencies. It's not something that I'm saying is definitely going to happen, but we've seen it happen in my lifetime. At least we've seen the US housing bubble collapse. If you've geared your whole life to be paying off a house and then the value of that house dips below the value of the debt that you have on it, that could ruin your life. I'm only half-hearted here in talking about it in terms of giving financial advice, but I think it's just worth remembering that these things have happened in the past, and there's every reason to think that there will be significant shifts in the future of our economies. This is because our debt to GDP ratios across the West in particular are higher than they have been historically, and the US potentially higher than we'll be able to survive. And the US is particularly important, not just for my American listeners, but for all of us, because US currency underwrites our whole global economy. And if there are difficulties with that, then they will ripple out to everybody. And they could be very significant because it's not even just the questions of the currency, but the declining role of the US as the only superpower and the accompanying trends as they're becoming increasingly isolationist with things like Trump's tariffs and, less interest in the foreign wars and that sort of stuff. If they're not interested in policing the world, that means there's a lot more insecurity that could emerge in the world and other centers of power. And a general deglobalization trend could mean that if you can't access resources cheaply from all across the planet, have complex networks operating that produce all the things get more expensive, whatever. I'm not dedicating this episode to this topic alone, but it's not unforeseeable that the value of money could change radically, that the value of the assets that you hold could change radically, particularly for those of us who have put a lot of money into what I think are potentially assets that could hit zero, which are certain cryptos and certain, share markets and whatever. Zero is too strong for most shares. And of course, if stuff hits a society-threatening level of collapse, then there are state interventions that will occur, just as they did with the global financial crisis. But whatever, this is a bit too in-depth in this, as I keep trying to dig myself out of talking about it too much, but it is interesting. The point that I'm trying to make is that the value of the assets that you have and the money that you have is not even across your lifetime. So to give a little example, when I was 1920, I had 3 jobs whilst I was studying at uni, and I used the money that I made from that work to pay down my student debt because in my mind, it was a terrible thing to have a debt and I wanted to be rid of it as soon as possible. And for me at the time, that cost maybe $15,000, $18,000 or something like that because you got a discount for paying it down early. But now, 20 years on, that seems like an insanely stupid thing to have done. At that time, what would the value to me have been of either not working all those hours while I was meant to be studying and focusing on that, or enjoying my, being 20, but also the value of $15,000 to me then, rather than $25,000, $30,000 paid over 10 years, it's crazy to express the difference. With that money at that age, I could have done any number of very fun things for myself, whereas the cost of paying it down gradually wouldn't have been as impactful at all. So don't think that the number of money that you have is fungible, or that the opportunities that you have at a given point in time are fungible, because there are windows that close and there's a dynamism to the underlying economic value of things that is out of your control. But what is in your control, and I think this is the good arbitrage opportunity of this, is to enjoy whatever choice that it is that you make. I think if you're choosing to make money and to save it or whatever, if you're choosing to spend the money and not have it, I think either way, from either end of that tunnel, looking back or looking forward to the other side, you would want to make sure that you are enjoying the consequence of that choice. So I think if you want to have a nest egg and enjoy that in retirement, make sure that you don't also then spend your retirement being, oh, I'm habituated to needing to save all money and I shouldn't spend money. Like, actively enjoy it. It doesn't mean spend all your money. Like, this is not the financial advice podcast. You would be a fool if you're listening to me for financial advice. But life advice, I'm not so bad. So the opportunity is to enjoy it. The other opportunity is to make sure that money and financial considerations sit in a hierarchy of your life values where you are not according it an outlier role that means that the control that you don't have over it is threatening your well-being too much or even taking away from it at all. If you can value money consciously in a hierarchy of things, then you can even enjoy not having any money because you'll realize I would only want to spend this money on stuff that I can have already for free. You know, it's not even a cliche. I'm going to waste my time on saying that money isn't everything. We all know it, but a lot of our social incentives are not geared towards us to enact it. In a similar vein, something that I think that has been overtaken in our conception of it, but still lingers on like a bit of a zombie, is gift giving. Not the act of giving gifts itself. That's great, I think. Just my opinion. I love to get a gift. But the way in which we do it ritualized and the way in which we do it materially has kind of, I think, been overtaken by a very important reality, which is we are much richer now and things are much cheaper. Most things. My grandmother might think it's a really nice thing to give me a gift of a wallet, for example. And I think this is because, a few decades ago, a wallet was a difficult thing that marked something special, whereas now things are mass manufactured and they suck. That's also another part of it. Most things that are made suck a lot more than they used to. But it's also not outside of me, even someone who's quite poor, to be able to go out and buy a wallet of my choosing. So receiving it as a gift is kind of not only less special, but often a bit annoying. And on the ritualized function of it, I've had a couple babies in the last couple of years, and despite living 15,000 kilometers from most of my friends and family, have still experienced a deluge of baby-related things by the kilo. That means I just have useless piles of stuff that people have spent their good money on and their lovely intentions. And a lot of, it really makes it stand out where consideration is given, because a lot of things are extremely helpful and, made maybe locally and have a compelling value separate to their physical function. But a lot of things are just, it's really, when you have a baby, you need clothes. Let's get you some clothes. 30 people think that at once. You have 30 different outfits for a baby that's going to grow out of them within 3 weeks. This is a common one that people experience, and, birthdays, Christmas and whatever. And you can see just from going out into the shop, sort of all the stuff that's there. Like, are people really buying all of those things? There's so much garbage or junk. It's a very poor value thing that's not enriching people's lives. So I guess the arbitrage opportunity is to have a discussion with the people in your life that you have those exchanges with, and figure out what's actually good. I know most people probably do this anyway, but still there's a lot of social pressure to get certain gifts for different situations. And I think having a conscious engagement with that means that you can have a richer experience for yourself and others, just with a bit of dialogue. Something else I think that we're doing just out of habit as well is all planning to go to university, or seeing university as a mark of knowing stuff or expertise, or like a minimum requirement to demonstrate that you understand things or have the capacity to learn. I think that that's slowly changing, but I think there's a strong cultural lag there, because for a while it's been the case that I can only really speak from the Australian perspective that I come from, but I understand and assume it's pretty similar across the world, in that there's probably just too many people in university for what vocational expertise is needed out there in the world, particularly studying certain things. And I have all of my education was liberally undertaken with the view to enjoy learning. None of it is directly related to anything that I do, or was it ever. I studied politics, history, strategic studies, and then a little bit of music, museum curatorship, physics, and like global governance. So it's like none of it is really directly correlated to what I then went on to do. So I'm not saying that there's no value in education for education's sake, because that's not my personal value set. I love learning things and certainly see the value, but I don't think that everybody needs to be dedicating 5 years of their life to studying something that's not really directly correlated to anything they're going to do after finishing high school. And not because that's not a virtue in just stuffing around or and having fun and learning things, but because there's probably better ways to do it. the university system itself, it's becoming an increasingly poor value proposition because the quality of education is getting worse and worse. You have less contact hours, more recorded lectures, less time with fellow students, et cetera, and the faculties themselves are being gouged of resources, while simultaneously it's getting more and more expensive for the user to do it. So it's kind of insane to me that it is still even as popular as it is. It is just, I think, a social hangover from the high utility that a university degree used to hold, and the absence of, I guess, a really obvious, strong ticket that you can take to market yourself into the world. In the absence of that at the moment, it is still a high social prestige in many circles, and it's going to be hard to knock off, but I think it's a good opportunity if you're a young person looking at going into education, or you're finishing your school and not sure what you're going to do in the world. I think twice before thinking that the best thing to do would be to spend 150 grand and 5 years of your life learning something that's sort of only going to be adjacent at best to an unknowable world. That's it. I mean, that's the other thing. How many disciplines of what we're doing now are really best correlated to their practice at university? I mean, it's certainly a minority, and maybe even then quite a slim one, considering most people are doing things like arts and law degrees, particularly in Australia. And that extends also that value to maybe schooling at all. One thing I didn't say then about universities, which I could have said, and which is also true for school, is that historically that model really works because you need to physically go and talk or listen to someone to get the expertise of whatever the topic is that you want to know. But now, not only can you access everything that a university lecturer is going to tell you, but you can access it from, no offense, a superior communicator who knows more about the topic. And you can also access that information in a way that scaffolds your own knowledge so you don't miss anything and then fall behind. You can pace it, and you can do it in your own time. Not only can you do it from your own time, you can do it from anywhere in the world. So, yes, I think that the value proposition for schooling and university is really imploded and really needs a revolution to find its core value for what it is, because so much of it is something for parents to get their kids to do during the day, because we can't all have our kids shadowing us and learning the trade of whatever nonsense it is that we're up to out there. And I think that needs to be reckoned with, because there is a genuine benefit to that. And there's also all the other things that you learn at school. Many of them can be great, many of them aren't. And it just doesn't really feel like schools are very well geared at that outcome, at least not the ones that I've encountered. The corollary of that is there's a huge arbitrage advantage for if you have the capacity to pursue your own education in the things that you want to learn, or don't just assume that you need to be enrolled into a Bachelor of Engineering to learn the basics of engineering. You can go out and get a book and then work with a guided YouTuber, like a Khan Academy for maths, and there'll be equivalents for all disciplines. All the, oh goodness, I've forgotten what they're all called, but there's all the online qualifications that you can get now, Coursera and other such places, edX, Udemy, Khan Academy. Yes, it's not all just Duolingo out there. There's lots of genuinely high utility ways of learning specialized skills. So that's one thing, which I think is already a huge benefit, because it means instead of thinking about the social abstraction of like, oh, what can I use this degree to get or whatever, you start thinking about, oh, what is it that I actually want to be good at doing, which I think is probably going to set you in better stead for doing things. Makes sense. And the other opportunity is that you're just not going to, it's just that opportunity cost. You're not going to waste your time doing things that are only adjacent to your interests, or like, kind of like parallel but moving away slowly. So if I'd done a Khan Academy geometry course, I could tell you what those types of lines are. But you can pursue the things that are actually going to be of direct utility to you and not waste your time, and find that you need to correct, or find that you're being overtaken by people who are just doing the thing that you're going to be competing in them with. So I'm a bit concerned that I've been a bit too negative by spending more time on the poor planning traps than the opportunities. So I want to close out by talking about some exceptional value propositions. And I think that as the world, this is one of my main premises that I talk about on the show. If this is your first listen, strap in. But I think that as we sort of increasingly codify the world into quantifiable metrics that don't perfectly match to reality, these sort of arbitrage opportunities are opening wider and wider, and not in a sense that we should all be cashing in and buying a lot of shares or whatever, having wins like that. But I think that there are huge wins to be had by really living through your own sensory experience and accessing the things that you enjoy, and putting a conscious value on holding those things highly, because I think that they're incentivized less and less to be pursued as, I guess, things become commodified and the idea of any value is something that you pay for. And just to give an example, I think there's this there is this collective overinvestment in unit metrics. Yeah, one example, GDP. we try and gear things to make sure that GDP is going up. We try and understand what productivity is so that we can all feed into GDP growing. But of course, if GDP grows 100% in your lifetime, but twice as many people are not able to have secure housing, that sucks. That's not actually good. And so as a result, where everybody's fixating on the unit measurements of various things, doesn't have to be GDP, it could be anything. You see it everywhere, this fixation on the unit measurements of things. You can think, well, what actually matters to me, stepping away from this idea, and even, me, that's just then I picked housing security because I think it's an important one, but to divest even from that, to be like, okay, well, if I accept that housing security is not that important, what is important? And then, it's kind of the ultimate conclusion of a lot of these explorations in this podcast. I think that there's a huge arbitrage advantage to be had in valuing things like hanging out really highly, or just hanging out. Spending time with the people that you love is an easy thing to overlook. It's easy to fill your life with other things and to give less time to that. It's easy to lose touch with the natural world. It's easy to look like, shouldn't frame these as a negatives. As the sort of fixation on quantifiable metrics and market value and things like that keeps increasing, because it will, particularly now that we've got large language models to sort of take the informational sphere as we've codified it and run with it further, that'll become even more thorny and spiky, I predict. The value to be gained from the simple pleasures of life and really prioritizing them into your everyday is only higher and higher, because it'll be, in a way, more cognitively costly to access, I think. So cultivate little pockets of leisure where you can. I think it's going to be a boom industry for you across the arc of your life. I'm maybe going to finish with an anecdote that my uncle told me maybe a decade ago. It's a tale of a guy who he stays in Fiji, and he's got a fishing boat, and he loves to go out and catch some fish and sell them. And he's quite good at it. So he catches more fish than other people. And gradually he starts to employ other people to do that with his methods. And he gets a whole fleet, and he's managing all the guys. They're going out fishing, selling in the market, and he's has to wrangle that. They grow over to a new bay, whatever, you get where this is going. And then at the end, all he wants to do is to have time to retire so that he can just hang out on the boat and fish on his own, which is, of course, what he had the whole time. My uncle told me this. Poor guy, it's a resonant tale for him, because he's a total workaholic, and he yearns to be out, just metaphorically sitting on that boat, fishing alone and relaxing. These things are already accessible to us, and something I like to say is that life becomes hard when you forget how easy it is. All right, I hope that some of this episode was useful for you, and thank you so much. If you did enjoy listening, please do share it with anyone that you know that might get a benefit from it, and go back and listen to all the other episodes. They don't date generally. They're not time specific. They're all just ideas, and plenty more to come. If you're interested in shaping what happens in the show, please consider joining the Patreon. There's a free tier where you can vote on the polls, and next week's episode, spoiler alert, will be from the recent round of polling that I did. And of course, if you do really, really enjoy the show, I invite you heartily to join as a paid up patron. It's the type of thing that keeps me prioritizing these and keeps them good. And plus, there's a whole bunch of other activity that I do that you might enjoy. I published a piece this week on the poor utilization of history in understanding the Ukraine-Russia conflict, but I also do music, other such shows, whatever. It's a rich tapestry, and welcome to my world. Thanks for being a part of it. Look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.